everyone! My name is Rachel Christ. I am the Director of Education here at the Salem Witch Museum. Welcome to the first in a series of new videos. Yay! Very exciting, I know. As some of you may know, this video project started during the COVID-19 shutdowns that started in March this year. So essentially, when it became apparent that we were going to have to shut down and we weren't going to be able to host our March Women's History Day event, we kind of made a spur-of-the-moment decision to host this event, at least in a partial form, through Facebook Live. And that was a first for our museum. We took a step and forayed into a new platform, and it was really a great experience. It went very well that first day. We basically did a substitution video talking about the women we would have highlighted during that event. And because we got such a great feedback from that first Facebook live stream, we essentially expanded this into a whole series of live streams. So every Sunday throughout the shutdown, so for approximately 3 months, I hosted a Facebook Live on Sundays. Now these videos were all about the history of witchcraft. So it was a very broad range of subjects, from the history of the European witch trials to Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, to the history of magic and common myths and misconceptions about the Salem witch trials. So while this was a great experience, when the museum reopened in July, we could no longer host weekly videos. However, we did promise we were going to continue with videos in some format, and this is our answer. This is how we're going to continue. So I'm very excited to start making these videos. They won't be coming every week, but we're going to make them as frequently as we can, and they're going to continue in the same format as the Facebook live stream. So before we dive into today's topic, I do have a couple of housekeeping things I do want to take care of right away. So the first thing that we need to talk about before we dive into this video, and you'll understand in one moment as we really get into it, but we do need to start with a kind of disclaimer. So in this video, I'm going to discuss the history of religion. So I'm going to do it in a very general way. It's going to be more of a summary, but it is going to be part of this video. Now, this is a very important and it's an extremely complex subject. With that in mind, I want to start by saying everything I'm going to discuss today is simply a history of the evolution of ideas. This is not a video criticizing or commenting on any contemporary religious beliefs. We're going to talk about religion in the context of history, so you do need to keep that in mind. It can sometimes be hard living in the modern world to talk about the history of religion. So I ask you to remember everything put forth in this video comes from the stance of a historian, and it helps us to understand the rise and the fall of witch trials in a historical context. So just keep that in mind as we continue forward. Now, at the end of this video, I am going to give some updates about the museum. I'm going to give some updates about this video project. So stick around till the end, even after we're done with the meat of the video, just to get some updates about the museum and what you can expect to see from us going forward. So with that being said, let's jump into today's topic. I'm so excited to be making this video and to be covering this specific topic. So if you've had a chance to visit us here in Salem, you'll know that our museum is laid out in kind of a non-traditional format. So when you hear the word museum, we more often than not think of a very particular image of an institution. So we generally think of a gallery space. You expect to see rows and rows of objects, artifacts, artwork. However, Salem, as so often is the case, is the exception to this rule. For those of us in Salem seeking to teach the story of the Salem witch trials, it's extremely difficult to establish a traditional artifact-based exhibit, as there are really few artifacts that remain from this period. What does still exist is essentially a handful of objects that are thought to have been owned by individuals involved in the Salem witch trials, and some, though not all, of the court documents from the court of Oyer and Terminer. So, for those of us with a passion for teaching and with a deep interest in the Salem witch trials, this presents a challenge. How do you create a museum with almost no artifacts? So our museum was built in 1972, and if you've had a chance to visit us, you'll know how we answer this question. You'll know how we've chosen to teach this history. So essentially, we come from a school of thought that particularly uses audiovisual immersion. So while this is an effective method, essentially asking you to step into the world of 1692 and to look into tableaus of this period, we also know that many visitors are still disappointed when they cannot view a physical artifact. So, with this in mind, over the past several years, our museum has begun to build a collection. We've begun to collect artifacts. So, this has not been an easy task, particularly as this is a brand new world for our staff and leadership team, and we really had to expand our creative horizons and look at objects that can teach us about the history of witch trials more generally than just focusing on Salem, and objects that help us to understand how the witch has evolved over time, and bring those kinds of artifacts into our collection. So this has been an absolutely exhilarating experience. It's given new depth and new possibility to the work that we do at the museum, and it's been unbelievably amazing to be a part of. So I'm very excited to announce today we have grown a small yet strong collection. So our plans are to install this collection in our museum as soon as possible. As some of you may know, our museum is currently in the process of a massive remodel. So this began with an interpretive content update to our second exhibit, Witches Evolving Perceptions, which was completed on March 13th of this year. So that entailed, as I said, a complete interpretive shift. We rewrote the content outline for this exhibit. We re-recorded some of the audio pieces of the exhibit. We installed some new objects. So it's really an exciting transformation, and it looks great. So our plan was then to update and reinvigorate our main presentation to be unveiled for our 50th anniversary, which will take place in May of 2022. However, the big however, as is the case for so many organizations right now, this plan has been delayed because of COVID-19. So with that being said, we are going to go forward with these plans as soon as we possibly can, and our hope is the delay will be minimal. The reason I include this side story in this particular video is this setback has impacted our plans for the collection. This is a long and complicated process. You can't just put objects into a room that's never really held a serious collection before. That's going to take some strategic planning on our part. So our hope was to make the investment to install the collection a year or two after the main exhibit update. Again, unfortunately, this is going to be set back for now. But again, hopefully this is a minimal setback, and it is only a setback. We will move forward. The collection will go on display. However, just because these objects can't be placed in the exhibit cases in our museum right now does not mean they should sit in storage. So we began collecting these objects for the purpose of showing them to our visitors to help forge new and hopefully even deeper ties to this history. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce you to the first object in this series. So several of these videos are going to focus on some of our collection objects. So we're going to take them out and we're going to show them to you as a way of introducing you to them. So even if you can't see them in person right now, at least you have some idea of what we have and what we can look forward to together, because we're excited to show them to you as well. So we're going to start with this particular artifact, because it's an absolutely fascinating addition to our collection and an incredibly important object in the history of the European witch trials. So as you will know, based on the title of this video, this object is a 1600 edition of the famous witch hunter's manual, the Malleus Maleficarum. So before I go into the detailed history of this book and its impact on the history of witchcraft, let's start with the saga of its acquisition, because quite frankly, it's a great story. So it was in December of 2018 that our collection had its first big break. So before that time, we had managed to collect a couple of objects. We had some things in our collection from years prior, but it was very small and it wasn't really on the road to growing. Now, we had just decided we were going to start looking, but because this was so new to us, we weren't really sure where to start. So essentially, at the time, I was keeping my eye on the internet.
So I was specifically interested in finding a first edition of L. Frank Baum's children's story, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, as this book is a fascinating element of the overall history of the evolving image of the witch, and that's a significant element of this exhibit. And as many of you know, we were eventually able to purchase a first edition of this work, and that book is currently on display in our exhibit, Witches Evolving Perceptions.
So one afternoon, I stumbled upon an antiquarian book dealer's website, and it was located just a few hours north of Salem. So to my shock and my surprise and my excitement, I noticed they had an edition of the Malleus Maleficarum listed on their website. So as I said, we will get into the reasons why the Malleus Maleficarum is such a supremely important book in the history of witch trials. But in short, as I sat at my desk on Friday afternoon at the Salem Witch Museum, I felt like I had been punched in the stomach seeing that this was available and it was so close. A real edition of the Malleus Maleficarum only a few hours away. So to bring this book back to Salem, to display it in our museum in an exhibit focused on the history and the development of the European witch trials, it was too good of an opportunity. We had to try. So essentially from there, I brought the discovery to our executive director, who in turn brought it to our CEO. Though I was unbelievably excited, I thought there was about as good a chance of us making such a huge collecting leap as there was of my discovering a time machine that finally allows me to travel back in time and witness the Salem witch trials. It didn't seem very likely that we would really seriously start building our collection here with this object. But I tried. We sent it up all the way up the ladder and I waited. So Monday morning, not yet having had a sip of my coffee as I sleepily was getting into my car to drive to work, I received a phone call from our CEO. He told me he had looked into the book and he thought it was worth the investment. He had called the book dealer and everything was arranged and we were going to pick it up that afternoon. Thus begins the internal screams. Oh my goodness, what a move. Everything had changed so quickly, and this was a huge step for us as an organization. Words really can't describe the blur of this day. When we arrived, we discovered there was not only the Malleus Maleficarum, but there were several other important witchcraft books in this antiquarian book dealer's collection. That day, we purchased not one, but several other books, which have all now been added to our collection. And that was the start of, for lack of a better word, an epic journey. So this series of videos, as I said, is going to highlight some of these objects, introducing you to some really interesting aspects of this new collection. I hope that this is an opportunity for us to learn and for us to virtually connect and virtually have an experience together, and I hope you enjoy seeing them as much as I have. So without further ado, let's begin with the introduction of the Malleus Maleficarum. So written in 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum is arguably one of the most influential books written during the witch trials era. Now I say arguably because this is really a hot button topic in the world of witch trials academia. So depending on who you ask, this was either the most important book that defined the European witch trials, or it was an early, circulated, and important book that has been overly exaggerated by historians over time. Now these are the two sides of the spectrum. The general consensus typically places this book somewhere in the middle, as an early and certainly incredibly impactful book that helped to define, or at least significantly contributed to the explosion of witch trials that ravished Europe during the early modern period. This was an important and influential book, but not quite the only reason the European witch trials happened. However, in order to understand the impact of the Malleus Maleficarum, we need to start by understanding the development of witch beliefs in the years leading up to 1486, which again is the publication date for the Malleus. So I'm going to give a very general explanation of the beliefs in witchcraft and how they developed leading up to this time. So if you're interested in learning more about this topic, there is an entire video in our Facebook live streams focused specifically on the European witch trials, which will give you some more context and also some resources for further learning if you're really interested in this topic. So it can be hard to understand, but the concept of a witch has not always existed. So, for our purposes, a witch was a person who made a pact with the devil in return for supernatural powers. Now, the belief in magic has been around really since the dawn of civilization. People have always believed that there are forces out of our control that help to explain the unexplainable and allow us to exert influence or control in a chaotic world. And there has always been concern that people can harness these forces for good or evil, that they can use them to harm others or to change fate or what have you. So that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the definition of a witch that leads to witch trials. So that definition being a criminal distinction. Witchcraft, in the context of the European witch trials, is a crime. It is something that you do that is against the law, against all moral order, and is punishable by death. Now that, as I said, is a concept that we can really trace the evolution of. We can see when it starts to emerge, and we can see when it solidifies itself to a point that it becomes such a concern that people start making laws to prohibit people from doing this. So this, as I said, is not an idea that's born overnight. It's the product of hundreds of years of evolving superstition combined with religion and intellectual debate, publications, arguments, belief systems that all mold together and eventually get to a point where people start to fear witches. And as I said, people have always believed in the supernatural, that certain people can harness this power for help or for harm. But the particular belief in punishment for the crime of witchcraft first emerges around the 15th century. Now, it's not within the purview of this video to dive into the complex religious history that gets us to this point, or to give a detailed history of the emergence of witch trials. But as I said, we do need to understand some of it, and we really need to understand the belief in the devil that gets us to the point where witch hunts are possible. So it's when people start to believe that the devil is capable of transferring his power to human beings that our story really begins. So it's a long and it's a complicated story, but essentially, the very abbreviated version goes something like this. It takes a very long time for the devil to become the figure that we know today. In fact, if we focus just on the Old Testament, the devil was really more of a trickster instead of the, massively, supremely powerful leader of the forces of hell.
And it's also worthy to note that the imagery of the devil changes dramatically over time, and that's absolutely not within the purview of this video, but just keep in mind, the devil as an image, as an idea, as a concept, has its own dramatic evolution throughout history.
I bring this into the conversation because it's over a gradual period as Europe is Christianized and stabilized that you begin to see intellectuals start to describe the powers of the devil that would dominate the early modern era and eventually lead to the belief that the devil has followers who are capable of harming those around them by supernatural means, aka witches. It's in the 12th and the 13th centuries that intellectuals begin to focus on the power of the devil and demonic. So it becomes a really hot button topic that intellectuals are arguing about among themselves, and everybody's got their own theories that they're putting forth. So debates question to what degree the devil can interfere in human affairs and if he can transfer powers to his followers. Now keep in mind, it's sometimes hard for us living in the 21st century to fully comprehend this development in this context. These are fixed images we have in our mind today. We have a certain image or belief in the devil, in magic, even in witchcraft that we think has always existed. And sometimes it's hard for us to step back and remember that there's a history to ideas. Ideas ebb and flow. Over time, arguments are put forth that change the way we understand the world around us. And this is part of that development. This is part of that story. So let's return to our witchcraft story. We've got that brief history of the development of the devil, and now we can return to witchcraft. So between 1435 and 1485, a group of writers began to describe a new group of witches. Now keep in mind, crusades against heretics had been going on for some time by this point. Heretics are loosely defined as a group that goes against dominant religious doctrine, and in this case that would be Christianity and the word of the Pope. So prior to this period, there were many troubling heretical groups. A name that might be familiar to you is the Cathars. So let's reach back into our 12th grade history lessons and, remember this general history of the Crusades and of these heretical groups that are being hunted during this time. So this new sect of heretics is brought up during this period. It emerges in the 15th century. Now, this new group was believed to be engaging in the practices of harmful magic. They were instructed and aided directly by the devil. And unlike previous heretical groups, it was believed that this group consisted primarily of women, and they are eventually labeled witches. Now again, it's important to remember it takes a lot for anyone to agree on anything. Now that's a phenomena we still experience today. And that's particularly true when it comes to religion. So during this time, there are 5 writers who are considered to be the new sect authors. So these were the men who first articulated this idea of a new sect of heretics. These authors were an inquisitor named, and forgive me, I'm gonna mispronounce these names. I'm so sorry in advance, but I'm gonna do my best. So the first author was named Ponce Fuegron. That's how I'm going with that pronunciation. There was a judge named Claude Tholosan, a town chronicler named Hans Frund, a poet and an administrator named Martin de la Franque, and a theologian named Johannes Nider. Though each differed in some of their details put forth, all 5 writers thought there was a new sect, and they argued about it in terms of an organization. This was an organized, secret group that was instructed and aided directly by the devil. So these heretics were thought to gather around the devil. They were thought to dig up buried corpses to bring to their meetings. They were thought to kill infants when they slept and to eat their remains. During their meetings with the devil, they would engage in the most horrendous crimes against humanity. They would commit acts of cannibalism, infanticide, incest, among other heinous acts. Now, it's notable to say at this point that there was no evidence that this was actually happening, at least not to our knowledge. There were no legitimate reports that there were these huge organizations of people committing these heinous crimes against humanity. There were certainly groups that were real groups practicing Christianity in a way that was seen to be heretical, but there weren't organized conspiracies of people eating infants. So, it was at the Council of Basel from 1431 to 1437 that the various ideas articulated by the new sect writers became widely circulated. At this meeting, religious leaders had the opportunity to come together to discuss the problem of the new sect of heretics, an idea which they then took home with them, spreading the thought throughout Europe. This new sect, increasingly labeled as witches, coincided with many other developments in Europe. So I don't want you to get the impression that this is the result of any one factor. This is the result of numerous things that are going on, from political to economic to religious developments that all coincide at the same time, and this is the reason why witch trials happen. And again, for a more complete history of the European witch trials, go to our Facebook page and check out that live stream about the European witch trials. It goes into a lot more depth about these other factors that are going into this developing fear and this developing belief. So with that, we finally arrive at the Malleus Maleficarum. So as previously mentioned, the reason for this video is primarily to highlight the acquisition of this book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our specific book, and then we'll turn to a more general history of the Malleus Maleficarum. So this very unique book, which is pictured here, is a 1600 edition of the Malleus. So this was the 4th Frankfurt edition and is actually 2 volumes bound together. Now excuse me as I nerd out for a second because this is so interesting. This is like a historian's dream, at least my dream, to hold a book like this. It is so interesting to hold it and read it and look at it and just be in its presence, to experience it, and to think about its history as an object. So the first volume in this book is comprised of the Malleus Maleficarum as well as extracts from Johannes Nider's book Formicularis. So again, that name should sound familiar. We just talked about Johannes Nider. He was one of the 5 sect authors, and that's why I brought up the 5 sect authors. So, this makes the inclusion of this text particularly special. So we'll talk about this in a moment, but the Malleus Maleficarum was very clearly impacted by Nider. So Heinrich Kramer, who is considered to be the author of the Malleus Maleficarum, was definitely influenced by the works of Johannes Nider, and that's very much reflected in this book. The person who published it chose to bind them together, showing that influence and that connection. So that's the first volume. It's the Malleus and it's Johannes Nider's book combined into one single section. Now, the second volume, the second section of this book, is a selection of other significant demonological texts. So these include the text such as the Treatise of Magical Arts and Evil Deeds of Magicians. So that was published in 1483, reissued in 1506. And that work argued that women, especially older women, were more superstitious, which is a claim that the Malleus Maleficarum also makes. For this reason, they are prone to fortune-telling and visions. They kill children, and they can believe, at least, that they can fly at night to large gatherings of like-minded, evil doers. So, in contrast to that work, there's also a work by someone named Bartholomew Spina, and he takes a slightly different approach. He insists that the only way to prove the existence of witchcraft is by testimony offered by witnesses in court. So he's a little bit more skeptical. He's not claiming that most older women are prone to witchcraft. He, as I said, is a little bit more skeptical at least. Definitely believes in witchcraft, definitely believes you should weed out the witches in your community, but it's interesting that this book is included also. So these are the arguments that are being put forth by the different writers during this time, and it's interesting that this is all bound together in one volume. You don't just see the thought of one writer, you see the thought of many different writers that were chosen to be bound together as one compendium of witchcraft thought. Wow, so interesting, so interesting. So these 2 volumes, the Malleus and Johannes Nider's text, along with the selection of demonological texts, are bound together in contemporary blind-stamped pigskin over wooden boards. So this edition was part of the Alfred Koch Library and was part of the same family collection for years. An interesting part about this book is you can actually see the top of it is more aged than the side and the bottom. So you can see that it was sitting on a library shelf for a very long time, which is really interesting. So several years ago, myself and our museum's executive director had the extraordinary opportunity to travel to Cornell University and visit their special exhibit, The World Bewitched. Now, if you did not have the opportunity to see this exhibit, never fear. There's a beautiful virtual exhibit still available online to this day. So we were fortunate, and again, to see it in person. And basically, this was a display of some of the incredible primary source texts in Cornell's collection that relate to the history and development of witchcraft. So on display were an array of books from the early modern period. One of these books being a copy of the Malleus Maleficarum. Now, this was a particularly interesting edition as it was very small, maybe 6 by 4 inches. And I am going to insert in here a picture of this book. It's not the best picture. I took it during our trip, but it gives you a sense of the size of this book. It's quite small. So we had the opportunity to speak with one of the resource librarians working in this rare book section of the library, and she told us this was actually a pocket edition of the Malleus Maleficarum. Now, that's a statement that speaks volumes. At one point, this book was so popular, it was made to fit in your pocket, so you could carry it around at all times. Wow. This librarian also confirmed an important fact. She noted that this book was, in fact, the second most popular book in Europe at one time, second only to the Bible. So we're going to get into this in a moment, we can debate the importance of the Malleus Maleficarum, just how influential it was during this period. But we do have to consider how many people read this book, how frequently it was published, and the legacy of that. It definitely impacted belief systems in witch trials during this period. It's also important to note a really important date that coincides with the Malleus Maleficarums. It was just 47 years before the publication of this book that the printing press was invented. So that's a really important thing to consider. The printing press had just been invented and was starting to come into popular use. So as the Malleus Maleficarum is published, suddenly it's much easier to produce books and spread it across a wider area. So it's much easier to transport information. Again, something that's important to consider when we're talking about this history. So after its publication, there was essentially an 80-year lull in witch hunting. So if you've ever been to our museum, you'll have seen there's a large timeline that illustrates the development of witchcraft in the West in our second exhibit, Witches Evolving Perceptions. So if you're a visual person, this is a great way to get a clear understanding of the European witch trials, how they started, how they, progressed over time, and how they came to an end. So there was an ebb and a flow to witch trials. This was not one long, consistent witch hunt taking place throughout the early modern era. So as termed by historian Brian Levac, there's a first period of witch trials. And this takes place between approximately 1420 and 1520. So the Malleus Maleficarum is published in this first period. So these witch trials were infrequent and smaller in scale. However, they're also taking place during the period where a significant of witchcraft and demonology treatises, including the Malleus, are being published. And that reflects the growing theological concern for this new type of heresy during this period. So, though there's this initial spike, there are initial witch trials that are taking place. As I said, they are infrequent and they're smaller in scale, and eventually they dissipate. However, after this period of decline and stagnation, witch trials begin again, and this time on an extreme level. So, between 1560 and 1630, there's an unprecedented escalation in witch trials across Europe. While there are many factors that go into this peak, and there are many reasons why witch trials escalate during this time, it is relevant to note that the Malleus had been frequently reprinted in the late 16th century, and at this time becomes an important witch hunting manual. And as I said at the beginning of this talk, it is a manual, and that's part of why it becomes so popular. So according to historian Julian Goodare, the Malleus remained the most commonly cited demonological work among Catholics in South Germany in the early 17th century. So it is being used, it is being read, and it is contributing to witch trials and witch hunts in Europe, especially in areas like Germany where you see significant witch hunts taking place. So, with that very impressive and long introduction, we do need to reel it in a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, the Malleus is kind of a hot button topic in the world of academic witchcraft. Some modern day historians feel this book was the most influential factor in the development of European witch trials. Some feel its impact has been completely blown out of proportion, and it was no more than a relatively popular book of its time. As I said, many take the middle ground, a position I'm also taking in this video, believing the Malleus was extremely important and certainly impacted witch trials and witch belief, but its publication is not the be-all, end-all defining moment in the belief in witchcraft. So a great quote from historian Julian Goodare notes, the Malleus was a work of its time and place, not a generalized totem to stand for the whole of witch hunting. Thus, its true importance can emerge. So let's proceed with that in mind. So let's talk about the author of this book. So now the authorship has actually been debated over time. At first, it was believed that Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, two inquisitors of the Dominican order, co-authored this book.
Now, you'll notice that our Malleus actually credits both Kramer and Springer as the authors or co-contributors to this work, and that's in a 1600 edition of the Malleus Maleficarum.
However, as time has gone on and additional research has gone on, most historians now agree the Malleus was most likely authored by Kramer, so Springer most likely was not involved. So we know Heinrich Kramer wrote the book after being criticized in his vigor in prosecuting witches in Isenburg, Austria in 1485. So he was such an enthusiastic witch hunter, he was criticized by his superiors for it, and as a result, he sits down and he writes the Malleus Maleficarum. Now, keep that in mind as we continue to talk about the content of the Malleus Maleficarum. So essentially, this book established several important claims. It's divided into 3 parts. The first 2 parts essentially lay out Kramer's particular theory of witchcraft. It asserts witches were real people who had supernatural powers derived from the devil. This power came from a demonic pact. It argues witches can fly, demons can have sex with human beings, and the one claim that always shocks us all, that witches frequently stole men's penises. Yep, that's really part of the book. There's a whole section devoted to it. You can't make this stuff up. So the third part of this book focused on how to prosecute someone for witchcraft. So Kramer asserts in this part that the severity of the crime warrants punishment to be handled by the authorities of the Inquisition, other church courts, and even secular courts. So essentially everyone should be involved in this because it's such a terrible, heinous crime. So this section describes the kinds of evidence that can be used during a witch trial. It gives essentially, as I said, a manual kind of description of what you should be using when you go into a witch trial.
So the Malleus also took a strong stance on certain controversial claims, namely the witch's flight. So in 906, the Canon Episcopi was published. So this medieval church decree denounced the belief in human flight, specifically discrediting the notion that certain women were able to go out and fly at night with the pagan goddess Diana.
So, because this is established, as I said, as a formal church decree, it theoretically should have discredited the belief in human flight altogether. However, certain writers in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries start to argue their way around this. So, to circumvent the writing of the Canon Episcopi, the Malleus specifically claims that yes, some women flew in their imaginations, weren't actually flying when they said they were, which is the explanation that's given by the Canon Episcopi. They say that anyone who confesses to this believes they're doing this in their imagination and they're not actually flying through the night. Kramer says that some women do believe they're doing this in their imagination, however, some do have the ability to fly. They were granted this ability to physically fly by the devil. They are doing this in real time in the real world. So Kramer claims in the book that he's interviewed a suspected witch who reported witches were capable of flying either bodily or in their imagination. So he uses evidence to back up this claim. So despite this logical flaw, this becomes a mainstream belief for a time, though not a universally accepted one. It's just something that starts to come up in many witch trials conversations. So we can't talk about the Malleus without devoting an entire section to its treatment of women. Now, of course, at this time, this is a patriarchal society that frequently abused and mistreated women in various ways. However, the Malleus Maleficarum is a particularly extreme example of this. So the clear misogynistic undertones in this text are interpreted by historians in different ways. So I'm going to get into one particularly interesting theory in just one moment.
So it is the job of the historian to investigate this as a primary source document. Is there a reason why this misogynistic attitude is there? Is there a purpose for it? Or is this just a particularly extreme example of one very angry and potentially psychologically disturbed man who has a deeply internalized hatred of women?
Now, quite frankly, I fall into the camp in this case, as I think Kramer probably just had some deeply unresolved issues that were being projected into this book. However, I do want to present both sides to this story, or at least both sides to this argument, and there are certain historians that certainly argue that the misogyny that's inherent in this book had a purpose. He did it for a reason. And I'll present one particular historian's interpretation in just one moment. Before I do this, however, let's take a moment to dive into what I mean when I say this book really mistreated women. And again, the reason why this is something we really need to focus on is because women are so frequently accused of witchcraft during the early modern period witch trials. So of the approximately 45,000 people who were executed for the crime of witchcraft, 75% of them are women. So this is a crime anyone can theoretically be accused of. Men, women, children, anyone is susceptible to the accusation. However, there's this buildup, there's this belief that women are the ones who are the most likely to fall into witchcraft. They're the most susceptible to witchcraft, and they are the ones who are most frequently accused and most frequently punished for witchcraft during this period. And that is partially the result of the Malleus Maleficarum. As I said, so many people are reading this book, so many people are influenced by this book. It is certainly no accident that, or it's certainly important to note the misogyny in the European witch trials and the misogyny inherent in this book. So I'm going to show several quotes from this book that highlight Kramer's particular view of women. All wickedness is but little to the wickedness of a woman.
What else is a woman but a foe to friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature painted with fair colors.
When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. Since they are feebler both in mind and body, it is not surprising they should come more under the spell of witchcraft. Women are intellectually children.
All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable.
Speaking on why there are more superstitious women than men, and of course superstition leading you into the folly of witchcraft, he says, women are more credulous, and since the chief aim of the devil is to corrupt faith, therefore he attacks them. Women are more naturally impressionable, and are more ready to receive the influence of a disembodied spirit. They have slippery tongues, and are unable to conceal from their fellow women these things by which evil arts they know. And since they are weak, they find an easy and secret manner of vindicating themselves by witchcraft.
Since they are feebler both in mind and body, it is not surprising that women should come more under the spell of witchcraft.
Why a greater number of witches is found in the fragile female sex than among men. It is indeed a fact that it were idle to contradict, since it is accredited by actual experience apart from verbal testimony of credible witnesses. Lovely. I know. So, as I said, this is just a part of the Malleus. It is one section. It is steeped with this very violent, very aggressive language, but it is only part of the overall book. Now, we're going to go back to that sensationalist topic that everybody's always really interested in, the idea that's put forth by the Malleus about having sex with demons, because this is an important part of the inclusion of women, at least by one historian's account. So historian Walter Stevens puts forth a really interesting and well-structured argument in his book, Demon Lovers, Witchcraft, Sex, and the Crisis of Belief. So in this text, Stevens focuses on the fascination of demonologists and writers with sex with demons during this period. This is a topic everybody is talking about and including in their works. Now, much like everything else, this is a highly debatable element of witchcraft. As I mentioned earlier, there came a time when the argument that demons could appear as a human or possess a human was accepted. This was not always a belief, and there comes a specific moment when it is put forth and eventually accepted by some. However, as I said, it's accepted by some. There's a lot of debate that goes on around whether demons can go so far as to physically touch or interact with a human being. So for centuries, Western Christian theologians argued that demons were pure spirits that had no physical bodies. So Walter Stevens argues that between 1430 and 1530, so around this first period of witch hunts when many of the first witchcraft books are being written, one can identify this doubt in the minds of witchcraft authors who are starting to doubt demonic reality. And by starting to doubt, I mean they're starting to question certain elements of demonic reality. They all believe in the devil, they all believe the devil's real, but now they need to unpack exactly what his powers are and what the powers are of his followers. So here we pause again to consider the cumulative concept of the belief in witchcraft. So by now, we all understand that the belief in the devil and his interaction with a human being is a major aspect of the belief in witchcraft. The secondary aspect being this belief in malevolent magic, a person who uses magic to harm others. These are two parts of the belief in a person who has, done the very worst and become a witch and are part of the legal distinction. So in his book, Walter Stevens examines a variety of witchcraft interrogations. There are some sensational documents that are quite stunning to read today. These different debates that are going on and writings that are being put forth at this time to try to justify the belief in witchcraft. So under the threat of torture and pressured by guiding, unrelented questions, accused witches were often forced to create elaborate stories about their interaction with the devil. Now, these stories often included vivid description of sexual encounter. This is all part of the witchcraft narrative during this time. So this is an important part of the belief in witchcraft, as in many cases, you can see the elite pressing the accused to give them the answers they expect. Again, when you are being questioned for witchcraft, you're under these guiding, unrelenting questions, and you eventually end up giving them answers they want to hear. You see that again and again and again in witch trials. So this is where Walter Stevens' argument comes into play. So he argues that this carnal knowledge, these vivid sexual encounters that are being brought up during witch trials, was the most complete form of evidence to prove the physical existence of demons. How else better to say that demons are real in the physical world than by saying humans are capable of having a sexual encounter with them? So to backtrack just a little bit, let's talk about skepticism. So again, we tend to think of this period as a time of complete and total anarchy, when anyone could be executed for witchcraft by these barbaric, superstitious fools who burn one another at the stake. So I completely understand why this is the prevailing overview of this time. But we must remember it is not an accurate account of all witch trials taking place during this time. During this time, there were still logical people, just like you and I. They wanted to understand the world around them, and they were using the tools and the experiences at their disposal to do so. There were skeptics during this period who loudly and fervently opposed the witch trials. So it's around 1250 that you start to see some skepticism relating to the belief in demonology emerge. This is a time when natural and metaphysical philosophy are beginning to be focused on by major religious writers such as Thomas Aquinas. So the goal of such scholastic pursuits was to defeat heresy. However, ironically, this also leads to a meticulous study of nature, which leads to questions about the corporal abilities of demons. And this brings us back to the Malleus Maleficarum. Now, according to Stevens' line of logic, the Malleus was not a book that sought to disparage all women, so he wasn't just an angry, hateful person who hated all women. Nor was this a sick, voyeuristic attempt to drag a bunch of sex stories into a publicly acceptable forum. Instead, it sought to prove the physical reality of demons, so it was entering into this conversation about the corporeal reality of demons, and it was seeking to answer it by presenting evidence of sexual encounters, which is again the best empirical evidence of the reality available. So Stevens notes, the Malleus is filled with evidence that its author, Heinrich Kramer, was never quite convinced by his own claims. So he's essentially saying that Kramer himself doubts the validity of some of his claims, and he's throwing in all of this disparaging of women and details about women being able to steal penises and women being able to have sex with the devil and demons. He's doing all of this to prove a point, to prove that the devil is real, demons are real, and this is a threat to society that needs to be taken seriously. So here's a great quote explaining the belief in Kramer's logic, and this again comes from Walter Stevens.
Kramer needed proof that demons were real, not imaginary. He decided that witches' confessions to copulating with demons would give that proof. Having argued that, he realized that he needed to explain how such copulation could be physically possible. No sooner had he finished that proof than he wondered whether his readers would believe women to be morally capable of such nefarious behavior. At this point, he sought out his commonplace books and strung together every unfavorable opinion about women that he could find.
Now, I won't continue going into the complexity of Stephen's argument. This, again, is a wonderful book, and I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in this period. He has a really interesting argument regarding the composition of the book, showing when certain components are added, as Kramer writes, and using this evidence as to show the developing thought being employed. So regardless of whether you believe Stephen's arguments or you believe Heinrich Kramer was just, a misogynist and, woman hater, either way, I hope I've given you a relatively complete overview of this work and the complexities of this part of the argument at least. The legacy of the Malleus Maleficarum is not to be overstated. This book impacted the formation of witch trials, and as I said, it ultimately contributes to the deaths of as many as 45,000 people, about 75% of whom are women. I don't quite have the words to articulate what it's like to hold a 17th century edition of this book. If you love history and if you love museums, I'm sure this is an experience you've had before. Looking at an object and letting your mind wander back through its history, wondering if it could talk, what stories it would tell, it's an experience that is really important. And I hope that even just seeing these pictures here gives you at least some element of that experience. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. As I mentioned earlier, this is just one of a series to come. Now, I don't know how regular these videos are going to be, so bear with me as I foray into the world of video editing and technology and whatnot. And if there are any specific topics you want us to focus on as we continue onward, please let us know. Send us a Facebook message, send us an Instagram message. You can send us an email at faq@salemwitchmuseum.com. I'm happy to focus topics on whatever the general interest is. And as I said, we will make more videos highlighting some of the other collection objects. So again, I want to add some housekeeping notices before we conclude the video. So I do want to take a moment to discuss the changes that are going to be coming soon. So as the Director of Education, it is my job and my passion to promote history and education and to get it out to as many people as I can to the absolute best of my ability. So along those lines, I am still going to make free videos and build free virtual resources. And I'm going to do as much of it as I can going forward. So if you've seen our social media or our website, you'll know what some of those resources are. We do have an entire teacher and student resource page, so check that out. It does have some free activities that can help you learn about the 17th century and life in the colonial period. That's all available on our website right now.
We also have a free online exhibit available on our website right now. This website layout is fairly basic, but it does highlight some of our other collection items that have connections to the history of Salem and also connections to the history of the evolving image of the witch. And that can be found on our website, which is www.salemwitchmuseum.com.
So with that being said, I do also want to make you aware that over the next few months, we are going to release several videos that will require a small payment to access. So I hope you can understand why we've chosen to take that step. And again, I'm going to try to balance it with as much free content as I can as well. So if you feel so inclined as to pay for the content, I promise you won't be disappointed and we really appreciate the contributions. So again, thank you so much for your support, for your kindness. This is truly an incredible community and we've just seen that proven over and over again over the past couple of months. So with that being said, thank you again for watching this video. Look out for more content to come. It's just going to keep coming, I promise, and hopefully I'll get faster and better at making these videos as we go along. So until next time, thank you so much for watching this video and I will see you in our next video.